The Libyan unrest has become the bloodiest of all of the Arab revolts so far. Out of all the leaders, Gaddafi's been the only one at this point to use such brazen force against his own people. What's he trying to achieve? Trying to instill fear, instill dissension among the protesters?
Well, he's a dictator.
He was a dictator, and not only a dictator, but a very brutal dictator. And no one says no to a dictator.
For 4 decades, the Gaddafi regime ruled the Libyan people with an iron fist. And one of the world's longest-serving dictators.
A mad despot spinning out of control.
As many as 50,000 Libyans lost their lives in the battle to unseat dictator Muammar Gaddafi from his bloody 40-year reign.
Let us move on to our next questioner. At the microphone over there, Mr. Edelman.
Welcome to America, Mr. Mandela. I'm Ken Edelman. Those of us who share your struggle for human rights and against apartheid have been somewhat disappointed by the models of human rights that you have held up since being released in jail. You've met over the last 6 months 3 times with Yasser Arafat, who you have praised. You have told Gaddafi that you share the view and applaud him on his record of human rights and his drive for freedom and peace around the world. And you have praised Fidel Castro as a leader of human rights and said that Cuba was one of the countries that's head and shoulders above all other countries in human rights, despite the fact that documents at the United Nations and elsewhere show that Cuba is one of the worst. I was just wondering, are these your models of leaders of human rights? And if so, would you want a Gaddafi or an Arafat or a Castro to be a future president of South Africa?
One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies. Colonel Gaddafi, Fidel Castro support our struggle to the hilt. There is no reason whatsoever why we should have any hesitation about hailing their commitment to human rights as they are being demanded in South Africa. Our attitude is based solely on the fact that they fully support the anti-apartheid struggle. They do not support it only in rhetoric. They are placing resources at our disposal for us to win the struggle. That is the position.
To answer that question, we must travel back in time to June 7, 1942, when Colonel Muammar Abu Minya Mohammed al-Gaddafi was born. He was born to no birth certificate in the desert of Sirte, to a poor peasant family with whom he lived a simple life, tending to his father's camels and goats.
I asked them what Gaddafi was like as a child. His father said that he was a pious little boy who never forgot his prayers, and that he was reserved and shut in on himself.
Gaddafi was born into Islam and grew fond of it as he grew into a man. His father told the BBC in a 1975 interview.
At primary school, we were too poor to pay for lodgings, so he slept in the mosque and walked home 20 kilometers through the desert every weekend.
Gaddafi was given a traditional religious primary education. He attended the Shabha Preparatory School in Fizan from 1951 to 1961. Gaddafi and a small group of friends he made in school went on to form the leadership of the militant revolution that overthrew the Libyan monarchy in the 1960s. In 1961, Gaddafi was expelled from the Shabab Preparational School for political activism. He went on to study in the University of Libya and a law major, where he graduated with high grades. While in the university, he joined the military academy of Benghazi in 1963. Gaddafi, with fellow inspiring revolutionaries, concocted secret plans to seize control of the country while in the academy. In the times before the coup, Libya was under the brutal rule of King Idris, who was a Western-backed and supported tyrant who used fear and starvation to keep hold of its iron fist rule, making Libya the poorest country in Africa. Gaddafi, seeing the corruption and mass poverty of his country, was determined to overthrow the king, The poor majority of Libya who had no homes or literacy were his inspiration and moral backing for change. On the 1st of September 1969, Gaddafi and a handful of men led a successful bloodless coup against King Idris while he was away for medical treatment in Greece.
Backed by a handful of officers, the then 27-year-old captain toppled the corrupt but pro-Western monarchy of King Idris.
After the revolution, Gaddafi and his revolutionaries took absolute power over the country. Gaddafi himself admitted that he had dictatorial powers up until 1977. In between 1969 and 1977, Gaddafi stood in place of the people, saying, "We are the people," when it came to making decisions that concerned the nation. Decisions like, for example, the nationalization of the country's oil, or the evicting of American troops from Libyan soil. Gaddafi was a socialist, but he also held conservative views, drawn from his own personal opinion of how a state should be run. For example, he believed in private ownership of land, also in an armed population, both of which are contrary to the Communist Manifesto. Socialism, just like communism on the surface, seems like a wonderful means of running a society, but when implemented, all nations that have practiced it collapse within themselves. States where men claim the interests of the people as their own, and claim to be in the people's stead, such nations lead to brutal dictatorships, as the well-being of the people is determined by the benevolence of its leader, which in most cases is non-existent. In between 69 and 77, Gaddafi ruled the new Libya in an Islamic approach, but with a socialist means. He imposed Islamic morals on Libya, applying what he called Islamic socialism in order to shift the nation in the direction of popular direct democracy. Prior to the revolution of 69, Libya was ruled by a brutal authoritarian, and after the September 1st coup, he was replaced by another authoritarian by the name of Muammar Gaddafi, as they both had absolute power. But Gaddafi claimed he gave up power in 1977 after the declaration of the Jamahiriya.
I feel more tired tonight than in the past 40 years. I have been out of power since 1977, when I gave the power to the people and the society of the masses was established.
I do not have a position to resign from like other presidents.
ما عنده منصب حتى يزعل ويستقيل منه كما فعل الروساء. معمر القذافي ليس رئيس، هو قائد ثورة.
Gaddafi has millions of supporters because he is not a ruler and he is not a president. Gaddafi did not come through fake elections with campaign funding from abroad.
ومن طلب في 2000 قبيلة تفاهموا مع رؤساء القبائل، قبائل الشعب الليبي في ملتقاها تاريخي، تفاهموا معه، تفاهموا مع المؤتمرات الشعبية الأساسية، تفاهموا مع القيادة الشعبية الاجتماعية اللي تمثلتها القبائل. الشعب، أنا ما نقدرش نحكم على الشعب الليبي أبدا، ولا نقول له أقبل هذا ولا ما تقبلش هذا ولا تفاوض مع هذا أو ما تفاوضش مع هذا. أنا نترك كل شيء للشعب الليبي. الشعب الليبي هو اللي قرر مصيره، هو الشعب السيد، هو الشعب الحر. أنا أعطيت السلطة من عام 77، من عام 77 تنازلت عن كل شيء للشعب الليبي. تفضلوا إذا تبغوا السلام أو تبغوا الحل تعالوا للشعب الليبي. أنتوا تبغوا البترول ما تقدروش تحتلوه، لكن تفاهموا مع الشعب الليبي على البترول. تبغوا الأرض الليبية ما الشعب الليبي مش هيبقى.
After publishing the Green Book in 1975, Gaddafi publicly spoke of implementation of direct democracy. It was only in 1976 that steps were actually taken towards it, and in March 2nd of 1977 that was actually achieved.
The revolution succeeded in achieving direct democracy, which everyone had thought impossible. It had always been the dream of humanity, philosophers and thinkers. But because they thought this was impossible, the people were subjected to dictatorial rule by the party or parties, by the individual, the class, the tribe or the family. We have now achieved direct democracy in a practical form. Committees and syndicates are now to be found everywhere, and these meet annually to decide social policy. And thus we see the end of what is called traditional government and the end of all authority other than the people's authority.
And the country is what he calls a jamahiriya. It's run by a new system of direct democracy.
How can the new form of government you have here in Libya meet the needs of the people when there are no parties and no parliament and no opposition?
And no government also.
And no government. How is that possible?
The authority of people.
Some people would say that this is a way of disguising a one-man state.
Oh, vice versa. It
is the opposite. It is the people replacing one man.
In March 2nd, 1972, a new leaderless Libya was born before the General People's Congress in Shebha. The new Libya was based off Gaddafi's Green Book, whose thesis was for social, political, and economic power to be in the hands of the masses of the people. The book presented solutions to socio-economic and political problems in democracy by advocating a participatory democracy, whereby traditional government is replaced with people's conferences and people's committees. Now, the People's Conference is made up of the entire adult Libyan population. They have the final and supreme authority in the country. They as well set up the People's Committees, whose duty is to carry out the decisions made by the People's Conferences. In Western democracies, we have politicians who make decisions on behalf of the people. Then these decisions are implemented by bureaucrats. In Libya, politicians were replaced by the People's Conferences or popular congresses. And in place of bureaucrats, we had the People's Committees. No elected individuals made decisions on behalf of the Libyan people. Instead, the Libyan people were their own bosses, as they set up committees from amongst themselves to carry out or implement decisions that they made.
And they've divided the country up into about 2,000 people's congresses. And they've actually built congress halls, meeting halls, where people can come together at various times of the year. Virtually the entire country comes together and meets in these various meeting halls that they have, or people's congresses, and the issues of international, domestic, and local affairs are discussed in a free context. They establish committees to carry out the activities that are decided upon by the people themselves.
The Jamhuriya is the inevitable outcome of human development in history and of political and historical development. In the first stages, there were the monarchies, where the monarch owned the land and whatever was on that land. And the people had nothing to do but to think he was God's gift to earth. This is over. Then there was a second stage, the republics, where people were allowed to choose the monarch. That is, choose who should rule over them, like a president, which is more or less a king. The third stage is the Jamhuriya, where people rule themselves by themselves. And they can do away with an election system in order to elect someone who could rule over them. This means the state of the masses.
Gaddafi wanted to do away with the majority of what he called parliamentary rule, whereby 51% of elected individuals have a lion's share of power, which was the key motivation for the concept of the state of the masses. But Gaddafi didn't have to look to his own creation of a political philosophy to solve that problem. The solution to that problem is the foundational bedrock of a constitutional representative republic, which is what America is today. Many people believe America to be a liberal democracy, but in reality it is not. That is why the rights of the few are not superseded by those of the many, via the Congress and Senate. The founding fathers of America based the American system on equal treatment of all citizens, with the recognition and protection of the rights of the minority. The reason Gaddafi ignored the American system is because of capitalism, which he vehemently rejected.
Why do you reject capitalism? Can I add to that question? Do you accept that capitalism has successfully industrialized countries and made them wealthy?
عليه حال الرأسمالية مرفوضة من الناحية الاقتصادية.
On the whole, we reject capitalism because it means accepting the monopoly of ownership in the economy by capitalists, companies included. And we reject this because the communism we believe in is about participation, not wage slavery.
After March 2nd, 1977, Libya was renamed into the Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. Libya became the most prosperous nation in Africa.
We also visited Libya before, and what we found was a normal situation where people were fine. Differently from other countries that went through a revolution, Libya is considered to be the Switzerland of the African continent and is very rich, and schools are free for the people. Hospitals are free for the people, and the conditions for women are much better than in other Arab countries.
Gaddafi nationalized key sectors of the oil resources and negotiated fairer prices within OPEC for oil-producing countries. He used the oil revenues to build schools, universities, hospitals, and much-needed infrastructure. Before Gaddafi, fewer than 1/5 of Libyans were literate, no access to education for the majority of people, and then after Gaddafi, free quality education system, including university, and the literacy rate rose to 83%. Libya has free healthcare. All people, including the rebels, have access to doctors, hospitals, clinics, and medicines free of charge. If a Libyan needs surgery that is unavailable in Libya, funding is provided for the surgery to be carried out overseas. Soon after the revolution, basic food items were subsidized and electricity was made available throughout the country. Gaddafi vowed to house every Libyan, many of whom were still living in tents and houses made out of oil drums. He also vowed that his own parents, who lived in a tent, would not be housed until every Libyan was housed.
His mother had only one complaint. Her son insists that they remain in their tent until every Libyan is properly housed.
He fulfilled that promise, his own father dying before he had the opportunity to move him into a home. Large-scale housing construction took place right across the country, all Libyans being given a house or apartment to live in for free. Under the leadership of Gaddafi, Libya has attained the highest standard of living in Africa, rated on the UN's HDI ahead of Russia, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia. In 2007, in an article which appeared in the African Executive magazine, it was noted that Libya, unlike other oil-producing countries such as Nigeria, utilized the revenue from its oil to develop its country. Gaddafi believes that economic democracy can only be achieved when the GDP of a country benefits all of its citizens, and when the country's wealth is dispersed to every single citizen. Today, money from Libya's oil revenue is directly deposited into the bank account of every Libyan.
It's also worth noting that Libya had the highest HDI in Africa. The HDI, or the Human Development Index, is made up of sub-indexes, which include income, longevity, and education. It was Gaddafi who coined the phrase, "In need, freedom is latent," meaning if you're in need, you cannot be considered truly free.
The reason that Libya was self-sustainable was due to a number of reasons, including its low population, the appointment of corporate-minded bureaucrats at high positions of power, and also Gaddafi's conservative opinions, which he drafted into the constitution. Socialism is not the oil that ran the economy machine of Libya. Libya was not the most prosperous nation in Africa because of Marxism, but because of the man Gaddafi. But that in itself had its backdraws, as the nation was overly reliant on him for their well-being and governance. When the war began, thousands of Libyans were financially trapped, seeing as their university education, wedding expenses, car loans, and many more financial constraints were all relied on the government to relieve. Libya was a big government state, where the state was represented by an individual, and so by dismantling of that individual, the nation was brought to chaos. There is a problem with socialist governments, and part of the reason the Libyan system crumbled as easily as it did, under the weight of NATO bombs and the uprising of Gaddafi's own people.
The West painted Gaddafi to be a 42-year tyrant because under him Libya had no political parties or elections. Therefore, that meant that Libya was a dictatorship.
I'll ask you about democracy because you use the word, but to people in the West, Libya is not democratic. They see you as an autocrat, almost an absolute monarch. I mean, how can you convince people in the West that your idea of democracy, which is very different from theirs, is still democracy? No political parties, no opposition.
اي طبعا هم عندهم الحزاب تحكم واحنا عندنا الشعب يحكم.
It is as though a ballot box and political opposition equal freedom and democracy. Elections in the minds of the West equals tranquility and paradise. But they never took into account the Libyan system, which they purposely never explained to their people.
Actually, you don't understand the system in Libya at all. You don't understand the system. Libya does not have a leader or president or king. Libya is a state of the masses. Power belongs to the people's congresses and committees. Since 1977, I haven't had any power.
After the 1977 declaration of the Jamahiriya, Muammar Gaddafi had no official post, but guide of the revolution, leader of the revolution. One of the greatest examples, if not the greatest example, of the authority of the people through the People's Conferences or Popular Congress was the approval of the gigantic and controversial Great Man-Made River.
وإذا تحقق لقاء النهرين نكون قد أسسنا شبكة ري ضخمة ليس لها مثيل في العالم.
A convoy of trucks is loaded with large concrete pipes to be used in the construction of what Muammar al-Gaddafi hopes will be the eighth wonder of the world.
Huge irrigation projects were established in order to support a drive towards agriculture development and self-sufficiency in food production. Gaddafi initiated the construction of the Great Man-Made River, referred to in the Guinness Book of Records as a wonder of the modern world. This gigantic river has managed to turn the coastal desert green.
In its early days, skeptics called it the Great Madman's River, a reference to the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi and its enormous expense, billions of dollars.
Any Libyan who wanted to become a farmer was and still is given free use of land, a house, farm equipment, livestock, and seeds.
Muammar Gaddafi clearly distinguished between freedom fighters and terrorists. All throughout his life, he supported struggle for freedom. From day one of his rule to the end, which was 1977 and onwards, he supported groups like ZANU-PF, which brought democracy to Zim. He aided the ANC to victory over apartheid South Africa. Nelson Mandela himself admitted that victory over apartheid South Africa would have been impossible without aid from Muammar Gaddafi. But all throughout this, the West painted Muammar Gaddafi as a state sponsor of terrorism. Gaddafi also supported the island struggle for freedom.
Colonel Gaddafi, public enemy #1 in America, gave an interview to an Irish television team which caused a hum on the international wire services with his words.
And if I were the leader of the south of Ireland, I would consider that the north is colonized and I would fight to liberate that part of my country. And that my country is deficient in its independence in that case.
There is a clear difference between supporting the just cause of nations struggling for their freedom and liberation, between that and terrorism. And it is one of our basic principles to support nations that are struggling for the sake of their freedom, to support those exploited and oppressed, be they in southern Philippines or in northern Ireland. We support them morally at least.
If you support the Palestinian cause, we thank you. Palestine is part of the Arab homeland and it is occupied. So whoever supports its liberation, we thank him.
Gaddafi was without a doubt a man of history. A man who built a mighty nation without a dime from the IMF or the World Bank. He was an intelligent, charismatic leader who loved his people and had a strong passion for Arab and African unity. But Gaddafi was not without his faults. The same man whose house was bombed by the USA in 1986 went on to say that Obama should be president forever.
It embodies the injustice and the cruelty of a man who is a tyrant. To kill a baby when she's asleep. Is this courage? Is this Christianity? Is this defense of freedom? This is America.
يعني أوباما يعني حده الأقصى 8 سنوات.
But do you think he should stay forever?
يا ريت.
He was brought out of the wilderness of isolation by Tony Blair, which was fitting, seeing as the British are notorious for hugging their enemies so as to find the best spot to stab them in the back. He was foolish to trust the West, and he paid for that mistake with his life. In conclusion to the matter in regard to Gaddafi's rule in Libya, Libya under him was a prosperous nation, with healthcare, housing and schooling subsidized by the government. But at the end of the day, Libya was a socialist state, with ultimate power in the hands of a few. Gaddafi's state, despite all its accomplishments, had several backfalls, including low wages for the average family, low youth employment, and the use of state funds to support escapades across the African continent, including building a mosque in Kampala, Uganda, and financing the political campaign of former French President Nicolas Sarkozy. Like I said before, whether Gaddafi was a dictator will not be discussed in this film, but Libya under him was not a model nation, but neither was it a brutal police state.
Da li možete da odgovorite na pitanje da li je Muammar Gaddafi bio diktator ili vođa revolucije?
On je samo bio vođa revolucije, nikako diktator. Jer jedan čovjek koji o svemu razmišlja i o svemu svojim srcem, svom narodu želi najlepše, ne može da bude diktator. Samo vođa revolucije.
So what about the people who see you as a dictator? Is that a word that you will not tolerate?
طبعا عشان أولا يعني هذا اللي يقولها واحد جاهل.